Welcome to today's lecture on marsupial behaviour and social organisation. The objective of this lecture is to understand the different types of behaviours that marsupials exhibit in their day-to-day life, as well as those behaviours that are used for specific functions. We will also discuss the social organisation of Australian marsupials. So from information provided in this lecture, you should gain an understanding of the maintenance, sexual and maternal behaviours that Australian marsupials use. You should acquire knowledge of the 3 different maternal behavioural types that have been identified and characteristics of these types. And you should appreciate those factors that determine social organisation in marsupials, with a focus on resource distribution, interest-specific competition and predation. So why is behaviour important? Behaviour plays a pivotal role in an animal's biology because it is through behaviour that animals solve ecological problems. So irrespective of how elegant an animal's form or physiology might be, or how complex their external environment might be, individual fitness is going to depend on the ability of an animal to find a place to live, their ability to acquire energy and nutrients, their ability to avoid predation and injury, their ability to find a compatible and high-quality mate, and their ability to successfully rear offspring. So behaviour is actually key to achieving all these goals. It is the gateway between an animal and its environment. I think that the study of animal behaviour is fascinating in its own right. I'm a behavioural ecologist, but it has also made important contributions to other areas such as human behaviour, neuroscience, conservation, resource management, and animal welfare. Adaptive behaviours are paramount to the survival and reproductive success of marsupials, like all animals. So the majority of marsupials are actually small, secretive and nocturnal, which makes behavioural studies quite difficult to conduct in free-living animals. And marsupials have not been domesticated, and because humans are eutherian mammals, it's only really over the past few decades that we've actually started exploring marsupial behaviour, and it's only over the past few decades that it's received any sort of scientific attention. So behavioural research on large species that come into contact with humans has been well funded. However, most research is curiosity driven, with the goal of better understanding marsupial behaviour for their conservation. So with eutherians, there's typically more applied outcomes to funded projects, whereas with marsupials, what the focus tends to be on is how behaviour and understanding their behaviour influences their conservation potential. So the daily activities of an individual, which we can call maintenance behaviour, these types of behaviours may not be as exciting as some aspects of social or reproductive behaviour, but they're obviously fundamental units for life. We actually cover some of these behaviours in specific lectures. So behaviours involving conspecific interactions we cover in our communication lecture. Behaviour patterns that involve biomechanics is covered in locomotion. And then specifically digging behaviour we address in our eco-engineering lecture. But there are other maintenance type behaviours to consider. So there's grooming, foraging behaviour, torpor and hibernation, and as well as shelter construction in the form of nests or burrows. So grooming, all marsupials groom to some extent. This is the cleaning of the body, and it typically involves licking, tooth combing, scratching with the hind feet, or washing by the forepaws, which is depicted here in this image. So after dasyurids, which are insectivores and carnivores, after they have fed, they tend to sit upright and use a combination of tongue licking and forepaw movement to clean their muzzles. which is essentially face washing. Foraging behaviour. So animals are continuously required to trade off actions and behaviours. An animal in the safety or a refuge may have little risk of predation, while one that is foraging for food is at a risk that it may become food for another. But obviously the animal in the safety isn't at that point in time acquiring any nutrients. So questions about when an animal feeds, where it feeds, and what it feeds on are actually of great interest in an evolutionary approach to behaviour when they are integrated into some strategic models of time and energy management. The answers to these questions are reasonably clear for most marsupials. So focusing on when an animal feeds, we know that most marsupial species are nocturnal or crepuscular. So crepuscular being the when foraging occurs at low light, so at dusk or dawn, but other species are strictly nocturnal, obviously when activity occurs only at night. So the driver for this type of daily activity behaviour is predominantly predator evasion. There is one strictly diurnal species, and this is the numbat. So this diurnal activity behaviour is due to their extremely specialised diet that is comprised almost exclusively of termites. What we see in this species is that as the day becomes warmer, the temperature of the upper layers of the soil will increase and termites will move into a network of shallow tunnels and chambers underneath the ground surface. So numbats, being the clever animals that they are, they can detect these termites with their acute sense of smell. They will then use their front paws to scrape away the soil and expose those termites, and then finally lick them up with their long tongues, as you can see here in this image. So they actually spend a lot of their time searching for and consuming termites, as they do need about 20,000 a day to function properly. So it is a very low energy diet for the numbats. So most heterothermic marsupials will display one of the two patterns of torpor that have been described in eutherian mammals. Daily torpor is a form of specialised thermoregulation where metabolic rates will fall to 10 to 60% of the regular basal metabolic rate. Correspondingly, body temperature also falls during this period. So you see a temperature drop from about 35 degrees from anywhere to 11 to 28 degrees, depending on the species. Some species also exhibit deep prolonged torpor, which is essentially hibernation. And this is when metabolic rates fall to a staggering 2 to 6% of the basal metabolic rate. And temperature falls to between 1 to 5 degrees. And that sort of period of hibernation can last anywhere from 5 to 23 days. So what we see here in this figure is that the majority of marsupial species are exhibiting torpor, with fewer exhibiting hibernation. So honey possums, sugar gliders, and even our own fat-tailed dunnuts are known to exhibit torpor, so ranging from 10 up to 20 hours in those species. Whereas the mountain pygmy possum can enter hibernation for up to 336 hours, and the feather-tailed gliders will hibernate for 120 hours. So this figure basically shows the frequency distribution of the longest recorded torpor bout for 20 marsupial species. So species displaying daily torpor have bouts that are around, that are less than 20 hours, and any species that are typically regarded as exhibiting hibernation have bouts of over 100 hours. So moving on to nest construction as a behaviour. Nest building has been described for a relatively few number of marsupial species. Some species will carry dried leaves or grass in their mouths. So numbats and dunnarts will do this. However, some species with prehensile tails will actually use those tails to carry nest material as a bundle. So we see this behaviour in ringtail possums, pygmy possums, and feathertail gliders. So you can see a feathertail glider here, clutching leaves for nesting material. And at the end of this lecture, I actually have a link to a video. So that video is 12 minutes long, and that basically it depicts the nest building behaviour of these feathertail gliders. Definitely worth a look. So leaf nests by species such as feathertail gliders are usually constructed within a crevice or under a log or within a tree hollow. Feathertail gliders will actually build their nest in anything from an abandoned bird's nest to man-made nest boxes. So the nest is spherical with about 6 to 8 centimetre diameter. Some species exhibit burrow construction. So digging beyond what we would describe as a behaviour for surface foraging is actually relatively uncommon in Australian marsupials, but several species do construct burrows or warrens. So marsupial moles obviously have a subterranean existence. They will both forage beneath the surface and construct burrows that they live in. However, we don't know a lot of what actually goes on down there. Wombats and some bandicoots construct burrows. So wombats actually form these complex system of underground warrens, but we're going to cover this in the eco-engineering's lecture. So moving on to reproductive behaviour. This encompasses all behavioural activities associated with reproduction, including courtship, copulation, parturition, and parental care. And so obviously parturition and parental care is reflective mostly of maternal behaviour. Courtship includes all patterns of behaviour by which the male and female signal to each other that they are physiologically ready to copulate and reproduce. But elements of this we cover in more detail in the communication lecture. Copulation refers to patterns of behaviour involved in the actual act of insemination. So today we'll focus on macropods in relation to mating behaviour. Behavioural aspects of kangaroo reproduction typically involve, first off, an assessment of the female's reproductive status. So this might include nasocloacal contact or the male tasting the female's urine. And so they tend to typically do this. Males will do this whenever they encounter a female. As a female approaches estrus or her reproductive phase, she becomes increasingly more attractive to males. And so this frequency of male assessment will increase. Males will often attempt to block a female's retreat or may follow her once she's detected to be reaching her estrus phase, and they can make vocalizations. They may even spray urine on the bushes or grass when as they're becoming aroused. So when a female accepts a male, mounting is from the rear. The female will stand crouch and deflect her tail slightly aside. The male will then grasp around the abdomen, often tucking his forearms into the female's thighs. And then what we see in marsupials is the curvature of the penis actually aids in intromission. So the video that everyone's been waiting for is here. So I have some image or a video of kangaroos mating. Fairly self-explanatory what's going on. So in in the macropods, intermissions can last anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes, and so an entire mating sequence will last from a few minutes through to several hours. But you can just see there the way the male's clasping the female around her abdomen and locking his forearms around her hips, essentially. So, females also exhibit postpartum estrus. So once a female's given birth, she's instantly or almost immediately able to reproduce again. So she enters what we call postpartum estrus. And then we see that there are that from what's been observed in Tamar wallabies in captivity, we see that there are a number of behaviours that we see from males. So we see that there's mating chases and a number of males will actually copulate with that female. So not all species have postpartum estrus, and obviously there's different timing in different species. But basically in Tamar wallabies, after birth, the female's essentially immediately attractive to males, and so they begin sort of attempting to mount even within 1 hour of birth with a number of mating chases. So what we see is that the first male will be ejaculating within 2 hours of birth, as the female is then receptive. So maternal behaviour, at birth, marsupial young are obviously altricial, so they typically weigh less than 1% of the maternal body mass. Marsupial mothers will assist their altricial young during birth and in their transit from the birth canal to the pouch. So they intensively groom and clean the pouch prior to birth. They will lick, moisten and flatten fur between the cloaca and the pouch opening. So this licking behaviour also creates a scent trail for the joey to follow. They adopt a posture that will shorten this distance and holds the female in a still kind of stasis state. So in macropods, we see that they have this typical tail forward posture, and in some cases with the back propped against a vertical object, as you can see here, with this kangaroo leaning against the fence, and then they stick their legs forward. So I have a video of a joey birth in the Western grey kangaroo. So this is actually someone's pet kangaroo who it looks like gave birth in their living room. So that white stringy thing that just fell out is the allantois. So that's the sort of the capsule surrounding that the joey was in and essentially hatched from before birth. And you can see the mum there licking the pathway from her cloaca up to the pouch. And then finally the joey emerges. So it's not obvious to me there how the joey is hanging on, but it's managing to. And the mum continues to lick. And then the joey begins its traversing to the pouch. It's a little bit off track at the moment, but it does straighten up. So it does find that maternal scent to follow to find the opening of the pouch. You can see it there straightening up. The mother seems to be cleaning the joey a bit. And then the joey has disappeared inside the pouch now. So this is footage of inside the pouch and the joey attached to the teat. So it successfully reached the pouch, and this was 10 minutes after it had reached the pouch, and it's already attached to the teat. So maternal behaviours function to protect, heat and feed the young. The attachment of the young to the mother's abdomen is, so whether it's in a pouch or not, is exclusively a behavioural trait of marsupials. In most marsupials, care of the young is exclusively the responsibility of the mother. However, we see that paternal care does occur in some species that form these mixed-sexed groups. So male sugar gliders will actually huddle with, guard and groom young. We see that the dominant male, who's the sire of the offspring, tends to provide most of the care, but co-dominant males will also assist, and these males tend to be relatives of the breeding pair. So the nature and extent of maternal care largely depends on pouch anatomy, as well as the mobility of those permanently emerged young. We see that there are 3 types of maternal care identified in marsupials. So these have actually been characterised. The first type includes the dasyurids and the numbat. So in these species, pouches are actually incomplete. They are simple ridges of skin that develop in the breeding season, or they are partial covering of some lateral folds of skin. Or as we see in the Dunarts, they are a covering of a circular fold of skin with a central opening. So litters in these species tend to be large, and they're held in the pouch for a relatively short period of time. After which young, although they still have small amounts of fur and their eyes are closed, they are then protected and cared for further in a nest. So mothers will return to feed, protect and huddle the young. So she herself will go out foraging and then return to feed the young. Displaced young will be retrieved from the nest. And what happens is the young will at first leave the nest with the mother to go on one of those foraging voyages, and then eventually they will do that independently. So type 2 includes the bandicoots, possums, wombats. In these species, pouches are complete. So the mammary area is completely covered by a fold of skin, and this may open either posteriorly or anteriorly. So you might want to think about why pouches open in different directions. Litters of these species are typically more than one, except in our larger species, so like the wombats and the brush-tailed possums. Young are well furred with open eyes, are then deposited in a nest or a burrow. So they may have a transitional phase of pouch life. Excuse me. Sorry. So they may have a transitional phase of pouch life. Some or all of the young may be carried while the mother forages, but otherwise they're in the nest or the burrow. Permanent pouch emergence first occurs when with the mother as she forages. So they tend to follow behind, or they might be carried on her back. Young are weaned quite rapidly once they're moving independently from the mother. So what we see in sugar gliders is that they'll emerge from the nest at about 110 days, and then they're weaned a further 10 days later. So the third type of maternal behaviour in marsupials is what we see in the macropodids. So in these species, pouches are complete. They're very well developed, and again, they can open either posteriorly or anteriorly. They have a single joey, which they carry to a late stage of development. So this is a characteristic of macropods. And what we see is that pouch life length is actually a function of maternal body mass via that formula there. So mothers are frequently cleaning the pouch of faeces and urine, as obviously the joey is spending a lot of time in there. And we see that, in fact, the joeys tend to have quite limited demands on the mother, or minimal demands on the mother, until they are kind of at a larger stage where they're able to stick their head out of the pouch, so they're large enough to stick their head out. Maternal care actually becomes quite a bit more complex once they start leaving the pouch, because obviously then there has to be some sort of negotiation about exit and re-entry, and then maternal vigilance increases hugely because the joeys might be at risk of predation. Eventually, the mother's going to not allow the young to access the pouch anymore, but lactation can still continue. So this phase is what we refer to as when a mother has young at foot. And so even after weaning, mothers and joeys may continue to associate. So it's not uncommon in these species that female offspring will actually remain in the natal range while the sons will disperse. So this kind of, with the female offspring remaining in the same area as a mother, you might see the formation of matrilines occur. So other behaviours, so we see that marsupials exhibit play behaviour, and this can be in the form of like locomotor play behaviour, object play behaviour, or social play behaviour. So social play behaviour is actually quite critical for some species. So, for example, in young male grey kangaroos, it's important for teaching them how to behave when it comes to male-male combat, and that obviously can have a huge influence on their reproductive success when they are mature. There's also specific learning behaviours that Mandy touched on in her lecture. And so I did find this study that showed that brain size and place, a study that was on brain size and play in Australian marsupials. And basically what it found was that species with larger brains actually tend to play more, which I thought quite interesting because the authors conclude that it's something to do with those species needing to be more intelligent, so they play more and there's more interaction when they were young, etc. But yes, I'm curious as to what this actually means, as we've learnt about the problem with using brain mass as an indication of intelligence or cognitive ability. So moving on now to the second part of the lecture, we're going to talk about social organisation. So the pattern of relationships between and among individuals and social groups define the social organisation basically within a population or a species. Factors that are important in determining social organisation include spacing patterns, mating systems, the pattern of parental care, young dispersal, as well as reproductive patterns. So like whether individuals are seasonal or not in their reproduction, and whether females might exhibit one cycle, say a breeding season, or multiple cycles a breeding season. So that defines mono or polyestrous. So social structure, this is the best possible structure in a given environment as measured by maximal fitness benefits to individuals within the organisation. So basically the resulting social structure is going to be influenced by three principal factors, and these include resource distribution, predation, and interest-specific competition. So resource distribution. So resource distribution basically refers to food items and how they're distributed through space and time. Predatory species depend on discrete, scarce and widely spaced prey, so we see that they don't typically aggregate in groups. So this is across the board for all mammals. However, it can be contingent on the predator to prey body size ratio. So if you think about lions that hunt buffalo in hunting groups, they obviously need to do that due to the size of the buffalo relative to a single lion, a single individual lion. So they work in groups to subdue these large prey items. In contrast, these small carnivores typically don't hunt prey larger than themselves, so they tend to be solitary, and we see that small marsupial carnivores do follow this trend. The largest carnivore, the Tasmanian devil, which consumes prey as carrion, is actually solitary. And in the dasyurids, which are also carnivores, so like our dunnarts, they may nest communally with related females or mating partners, but there's no actual long-term bonds formed. So some level of social interaction, but that's not, those bonds don't persist through time. So the marsupial insectivores and omnivores tend to hunt discrete items individually, so kind of very similar to carnivores. So these species tend to be solitary as well. Bandicoots will aggregate on a resource-rich patch, but there's no formation of a specific social group. In contrast, we see bilbies. So both bandicoots and bilbies are omnivores. Bilbies may be more cohesive and cohabit within a communal warren. So I want you to think about why we might see that there's more temperate species, such as bandicoots, being solitary, whereas an arid-adapted or an arid-dwelling marsupial species is living more communally. There's a clue in the title, so probably something to do with resource distribution. So the folivores share a common diet, but these vary greatly in social organisation. So folivores eat leaves. We have the leadbeater's possum, which aggregates in multi-male groups with a single female and her offspring. So this leadbeater's possum will actually exhibit group defence of a resource-rich area, and there will be a nesting hollow within that area where the female and her offspring are. Sugar gliders, they form mixed-sex groups, so they as a group, they may occupy sort of exclusive home ranges. So a group of individuals will occupy that same home range, but it's not, they don't necessarily defend that home range as a group. And so group membership is actually quite dynamic. You see a flux of individuals in and out of those groups. Group size is found to be greatest during winter, which makes sense when you think about thermoregulatory benefits of huddling in a group. Yellow-bellied gliders, these guys may be solitary, they may form pairs during the breeding season, or they may aggregate in groups of 5 to 6 individuals. So yellow-bellied gliders, there seems to be some degree of social flexibility in this species. So larger groups are evident when resources are abundant and stable. And so in this species, we see that cooperation may occur in the form of actual defence of these abundant resources against either conspecifics or competitors of other species. So nectar-bearing flowers are obviously going to be scattered, and they're going to be abundant and available at different times. So in the arboreal nectarivores, we see that they are typically solitary, but they may also nest together. When they do nest, groups are either unisexual or mixed sex of non-breeding pairs. So you're not getting breeding individuals, males and females, are associating together in groups. The feathered tail gliders are actually an exception, however, so they have a similar social structure to sugar gliders, and their groups will consist of multiple breeding males and females. So moving on to the macropods, the terrestrial herbivores, they can be divided into three social types. So these include species that are either solitary, except for reproductive associations. Some macropods may be solitary but aggregate on favoured resource patches, and then some macropods are actually viewed as being quite gregarious and having and forming social groups. So just to discriminate, there was factor analyses performed with a range of variables, which included shelter and feeding habits, activity pattern, size, sexual dimorphism, annual fecundity and birth distribution, as well as diet. So these variables were used to sort of partition out the macropod species into these different social types. So type 1 and 2 include small to medium-sized macropods. They tend to use closed shelters, they're nocturnal, and they're found to forage in or close to cover. Food items are quite discrete, limited, and require long search or handling times. So by handling times, we mean sort of like chewing time. And so the types of species that fit this profile are the potoroos and the small wallabies. The third type are the large macropods that are partially diurnal, so very crepuscular in their feeding activity. They are found to occupy open shelter and open foraging habitats. They predominantly eat grasses. So by now you probably recognise that this describes kangaroos and large wallabies. So just to summarise resource distribution in terms of social organisation. So marsupials range from solitary foraging on scarce, discrete, high-quality items to gregarious foraging on large, abundant patches of low-quality items. But obviously foraging behaviour isn't fixed and it is a plastic trait. So the optimal diet may be obtained in a variety of ways that may vary due to the quality, density and dispersion of those food items in different habitats. So there's actually very little evidence that marsupials will kind of, as a group, find and maintain control of a food source. We see that in some of the gliders, but it's not typically a marsupial trait. So rather, resource distribution is most likely to influence social organisation by the degree to which an individual can tolerate intraspecific competition. So how much in species can they put up with having other individuals around? So moving on now then to intraspecific competition. We recognise that interactions with conspecifics may aid or hamper an individual's acquisitions of resources or their reproductive success. And we recognise that intraspecific competition actually sets the upper limit to group size. So the relationship between sociality and intraspecific competition has best been studied where foraging efficiency is reduced by conspecific interference. So mechanisms of interference can include exploitation, aggressive interactions, as well as a reduction of the effective food search area for food. So foraging interference sets a group size limit that is recognised to be lower in macropods relative to eutherian herbivores. So here with the eutherian herbivores, we tend to be referring to even-toed ungulates. What we see in macropods is that slow progression on all fours and the tail, which is a pentapedal gait, is energetically more costly than a quadrupedal gait that eutherian herbivores have. However, hopping is actually less costly than a quadrupedal gait. So relative to eutherians, macropods tend to forage in a patch for longer and move at a slower rate while foraging, but they can actually move between patches at a faster rate. So what we tend to see in macropods then is that they will form these small unstable groups due to heightened competition with conspecifics at low speeds when they're feeding in the same patch as their conspecifics. And this is also, this sort of instability of groups is due to this poorly coordinated spatial proximity that you get at high speed. So what you see is that there's a dissolution of groups when there's movement between resource patches. So there was there's been a few, there's a study that looked at the direct effect of 2 or more individuals on the foraging efficiency in captive female red kangaroos. And basically what they found is that sharing a patch, so where there is conspecific competition, this incurs a cost of what we might describe as scrambling for food. So there's increased time spent in locomotion. So what you can compare here is this is walking, this is time spent locomoting. When group size is smaller, there's obviously less time spent doing that relative to when group size is larger. So when there's more conspecific competition, we also see that there is more plants. There's a cost of consuming more available plants, so there's more cropping going on. So again, similar sort of pattern as walking. There's obviously more vegetation being chomped when there's larger groups. But we also see that there's a reduced handling time. So they tend to be eating more but chewing less. So this is believed to maybe have a detrimental effect on digestive efficiency. So they're sort of quickly chomping but not chewing and accessing as much nutrients from the food in larger groups. And there's also obviously probably not a cost, but a benefit of a larger group is decreased vigilance. So you have more time to be cropping than having to be vigilant if you have more individuals around you. So with that in mind, thinking about vigilance, we've seen that predation risk can either favour group formation or it can favour a solitary existence. And which way it goes is going to depend on a couple of things. So it will depend on whether an individual is going to rely on cryptic behaviour. And with that, we see that size of the animal can influence cryptic behaviour. So small mammal species who lack the ability to outrun a predator may forage solitarily within dense cover, whereas large mammal species may form groups in open areas and then sort of explode into scattered and confusing flight among the cover of other group members. So the relationship between predation risk and social organisation for Australian marsupials has been a little bit confused due to this argument about there being a low predation paradigm in marsupial history. So Eleanor Russell in 1984 in her review asked why there tended to be less sociality among marsupials compared with eutherian mammals. So she very specifically addressed the question, why aren't marsupials more social? And what she concluded was that predation pressure as a factor of promoting sociality in large marsupials had not been convincingly substantiated. So her conclusion was based on evidence that there was only a brief interaction between marsupials and humans and dingoes. So on an evolutionary scale, the interaction had been quite brief. There was a lack of knowledge on the impacts of ancient marsupial predators, so we don't understand very well how those ancient marsupial predators might have influenced the behaviours of prey. She also based her conclusions on this low ratio of carnivores to herbivores that we see in marsupials, and also the fact that we see a dissociation of mothers and joeys from other conspecifics when mothers are feeding. So she kind of accumulated this package of evidence to suggest that there hadn't been a we can't say that there'd been a significant predation pressure. A few years later, a couple of researchers rebutted these arguments, and they actually provided evidence that marsupials had been preyed on by a suite of predators. So we learnt a little bit about this in our ancient marsupials lecture. And so they were exposed to, carnivorous marsupials, eutherian mammals, lizards, and birds. So they concluded that successful species have actually fine-tuned their behaviour to offset a predatory attack rather than fall victim. So in some way they were being able to offset any attack rather than succumbing to death from predators. And they suggest that they achieve this through behavioural flexibility. So in terms of behavioural flexibility, we might think about social flexibility and the ability to either form groups and not form social groups. However, I was a little bit confused when I read their sort of explanation, because I would have thought if our marsupials had evolved with a higher predation rate, they may have been still have those traits that helps them deal with those introduced predators that they're subjected to today. But basically, what the point was, it sort of came down to the size class of marsupials again. So small marsupials have no choice but to minimise conspicuousness in the cover of their habitat while they're foraging. So if you're hanging out with other conspecifics, obviously this is going to increase detectability by enhancing odour, auditory and or visual signal to searching predators. So you avoid other conspecifics at all costs. Whereas large marsupials are going to be able to escape a predator when it is detected at a sufficient distance. If you've got more individuals around you, that means there's more eyes, ears and noses available to improve predator detection. So what we then see is that groups are likely to form if the benefits of forming a group outweigh the costs of forming a group. So, and those costs that we've talked about is things like foraging interference, the need for coordinated activities with group members, as well as the chance that you are enhancing your detectability to a predator. So it's believed that all macropods occupying open habitats are actually large enough to effectively flee their predators, and so therefore benefit from companions that reduce predation risk. And so studies of eastern grey kangaroos, so there are a number of studies that have supported this idea, and so there is a benefit of reduced individual vigilance and enhanced foraging as group size increases. So essentially, that's what's shown here. So this study is by Yarman in 1987. As group size increases, time spent, proportion of time spent being vigilant is reduced, and time spent feeding increases. But what sort of a further study showed was that the benefits don't accrue equally to all group members. So those on the periphery of a group are actually more vigilant than within a group. So it was suggested that this reflects their greater predation risk. So if you are in a group, you're in a kangaroo mob, you want to be on the inside of that group, so you've got more time to feed and less time worrying about predators. So just to offer a concluding remark on this lecture on marsupial behaviour, I think that the challenge for the next generation of marsupial biologists, which is you, is to recognise that even though marsupials may not rule the world like eutherian mammals do, they are in fact excellent, if not superior, models for behavioural research. And so if marsupial behaviour is your passion, please, and you're looking for a postgraduate research project, please come and chat to me. And I have listed some further reading for you guys, and there is the link to the video on nest construction in feathertail gliders. Thanks for tuning in.